Pick one. Yeah, person. Now we can start the session now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Bangkok, Thailand. So welcome to the day 2 of virtual symposium on multi-hazard early warning and disaster risk reduction. So you are with the keynote speech session, so which has 2 keynote speeches with 2 distinguished the speakers. This session runs about 1 hour, which has a Q&A session as well. So after each presentation, so you can type your questions or the comments in the chat box or Q&A box, so that now we can direct those questions or the comments to the relevant speakers. So, so as you know that. So we have sufficient global instruments or the frameworks, global frameworks for reducing or minimizing climate or disaster risks, as well as building resilience of communities, systems, and the countries. So it is the responsibility of the individuals, each of us, as well as the communities and local and national governments to adhere to them, and of course take actions together to achieve the set objectives of the goals of these global frameworks. So the SFDRR is very much central to this sort of conference, in particular Target G, which is actually sustainable increase and availability of access to the multi-hazard early warning systems, early warnings, as well as the risk information and assessment to the people by 2030. These are the set targets under the SFDRR. So today, actually, in addition to that, so very much the nature-based solutions also, which we are presenting as Eco-DRR, so which is also very much connected to almost all the global frameworks. So today, as I was mentioning, so we have 2 speakers, and the first speaker is Dr. Anand Malvatantri. So currently he is working as the country representative of IUCN, the country office in Sri Lanka. So before he joins as the country representative to IUCN Sri Lanka, so he was working with the UNDP, as well as prior to that he was also working with the USAID, that is actually Director for Energy and Environment of USAID. So he holds a Bachelor of Science, Special Degree in Chemistry, and Diploma in Business Administration from University of Colombo. And he has also received doctorate in soil physics and Masters in Environmental Science. So without further ado, so let me ask Dr. Anand Malvatantri to talk about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions towards disaster risk reduction. Over to you, Dr. Anand. Yeah, this session actually to be the safe side, so because of the other issues and connections, so we have recorded and we'll play the record, but Dr. Anand is here with us, standby for the Q&A session. Thanks.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Dr. Senaka Basnayaka, Chair for the session, my panel members, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. First, I should thank Dr. Dilanthi Amaratunga for inviting us for this presentation. And also, you should recognize the efforts of Disaster Management Center of Sri Lanka, led by Major General Sudanta Ranasinghe, the Director General of Disaster Management Center. With that, we like to get on to the presentation, and today we will discuss about the context we are in, mostly the climate change impact context, and how NBS or the nature-based solutions fits to address some of the challenges. And also we will talk a little bit about integrating and mainstreaming green infrastructure that's part of the nature-based solutions toward disaster risk reduction, and a few tools and approaches that are coming out and being tested on the ground. This presentation will be followed by another presentation in the next plenary that will share a few examples. We know there are natural disasters, emerging disasters, and various type of disasters, including the slow onset disasters. All those impacts are poor and vulnerable around the world, disrupting their lives and their economic and social well-being. And the disasters also damage the infrastructure that are meant to help the same people who are mostly vulnerable. So it's a very opportune topic to talk about how the nature-based solutions can be adopted and mainstreamed to minimize the impact of different type of disasters. What do we want at the end of the day? We want a safe and just space, and we are in a changing climate. So pretty much we are working towards getting better food, water, better income, education. That's the middle of the circle. Resilience, and then our voice being heard, the jobs, energy, and our equity, gender equality, all that. And then around us, we have the environmental constraints, we have many other things around us, and then we are working on multiple aspects at the same time: the climate change, the water shortages, usage, fertilizer, agriculture inputs, and the issues like ocean acidification, chemical pollution. So there are multiple things that we are continuously being challenged with. And this complexity is increasing by the day. And the disaster risks are also compounded by the challenges due to climate change, sea level rise, the aggravated droughts, floods, and many other things, and then the different organisms grows at high temperatures. And at the same time, to our advantage, the technologies are also evolving, and the people's perceptions are also changing, especially after the COVID-19. There are people thinking more about environment. And also we have seen during the last, during this decade, many new concepts emerge towards a better environment or the better sustainability, like circularity, sustainable consumption and production, and doing away with the dirty power like coal and getting into more renewables. So there are a lot of things for us to work on that. So where's the nature-based solutions fits? At one time in the past, environment or the nature aspects were taken as a bottleneck or an impediment for development. So they were like in two camps. But with time, now people are realizing we have to work with the ecosystem, we have to protect the ecosystem, and we have to leave the ecosystem for the next generations to come. As a result, there is a lot more opportunities now for nature-based solutions and for us to frame the development in that context for long-term sustainability and resilience. We are talking about the society challenges these days, and then lump a lot of challenges into one basket and trying to solve all of them in one go. So we have conventions, we have Paris Agreement, land degradation related conventions, biodiversity related conventions, many other aspects that are bringing these aspects, highlighting these aspects and promoting us to work towards solutions. That's where the nature-based solutions comes in, and it has evolved quite a bit in the recent times. And International Union for Conservation of Nature has been working with many partners in the UN system and the leading NGOs and INGOs like World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, to bring out the best aspects of nature-based solutions. So the definition carved out by IUCN and most people are adopting is as follows. It reads here, and I'm not going to read it in detail, but it talks about managing and restoration of natural or modified ecosystems, and also to work on adaptivity and change things as we go on for the benefit of the human well-being and also for other benefits like biodiversity benefits and societal benefits. At the end, nature-based solutions, it was adopted actually formally at the 2016 IUCN World Congress that was held in Hawaii, where over 10,000 people attended. And it is at the end focusing about the societal challenges and finding ways to apply restorations and infrastructure, green infrastructure and the management practices for the well-being of the human and also for biodiversity benefits and many others. So IUCN is the largest conservation network in the world. It was established in 1948, and it is working with the governments, the UN agencies and many others to make the world a better place. And it has a large scientist network also working on different aspects of nature-based solutions. When you work with the environment, there is something is coming through very nicely. That's a complexity. The original natural systems are fairly complex, and once you transform them with the engineering and recreate different systems, the intensity of the complexity goes down and the management become improved. But at the same time, you need certain amount of complexity, diversity for the survival of the species and things like that. So when you manage these systems, it's good to have hybrid systems combining the engineering and also the green aspects, and understanding the systems and work with science and many partners so that these societal challenges such as climate change, food security, disaster risk reduction, those things can be addressed in a very productive and a sustainable way. So in that context, it's very important that in the implementation of NBS, it's important to bring in the science, policy and practice together. When policy is ignored, oftentimes we cannot go past political authorities. We all know that. And the support of funds are affected. When the science is ignored, we will end up with unexpected negative consequences. So we need to put all these things through the science lenses and bring the scientists, bring the academics, bring the policymakers, bring the practitioners, bring the beneficiaries, and all into one group so that we can take the nature-based solutions into the future. And there are multiple examples of adoption of nature-based solutions extending from mangroves to wind barriers to erosion controls to, we will discuss some of these things in the next presentation. The nature-based solutions can work on any scale. It can go from reach to reef, or it can work on the village or the lower society levels, and it has to work and generate multiple benefits, not only the disaster risk reduction. And these concepts also, as indicated, can generate unexpected, unintended negatives unless we work together and monitor together and bring the right kind of science into the process. In that context, IUCN came with a global standard for introducing nature-based solutions and practicing it. And it's a very user-friendly framework for verification, designing, and scaling up of nature-based solutions. It came out this month, actually, a few weeks back, and it has 8 criteria and 28 indicators for us to track what we are doing in the nature-based solutions. So it could be easily used by the government, cities, and the local government, planners, businesses, donors, banks, financial institutions, and anyone. So the value of that is it comes with the self-assessment tool that anyone who is using nature-based solutions can put in data and self-assess where things are and how things are working towards the expected goals. One aspect of nature-based solutions is nature-based solution is a must for climate change. Why? All the targets pointing towards 2050 are associated with some form of this green part of carbon sequestration to minimize the to make the carbon emissions net zero. So these remaining emissions need to be offset by sequestration, meaning green infrastructure. So because of that, there are multiple sources of funding operating in the world today, including Green Climate Fund, that help the countries, the communities, and the governments to adopt nature-based solutions and work on climate change aspects. And the UK has already calculated with the support of World Wildlife Fund, and they are expecting huge contributions through the nature-based solutions or the sequestration part in 2030 and down to 2050 to make the land-based improvements mitigating emissions, and also improving the land use planning to enhance the carbon sequestration. Another important aspect of selecting nature-based solutions for or any other disaster risk reduction intervention for that matter is the economic feasibility, because the long-term sustainability much depend on the economic feasibility of the actions we choose. So what we can do is to employ some of these cost-benefit ratios and then analysis and understand like what kind of nature-based solutions, what kind of engineering designs will help us to be sustainable. Now, for example, in this picture, it shows like measures below this line have net economic benefits. So what are these involved? So there are certain things, reef revival and all kind of things. Then there are a few things here. Wind up buildings and coastal steels. These are heavy duty engineering structures, seawalls. They all go past this threshold that are challenging the sustainability aspect. So it doesn't mean that you should not do engineering, but it means like you have to understand it properly and then get the additional benefits also into the picture. Because oftentimes the disaster risk reduction benefits associate with other economic benefits like tourism benefits and many other things, and not giving handouts, not feeding people due to the disasters, and all those things has to come. So now in this case the mangrove forest has been highlighted to withstand waves and things like that. Another aspect we talked a lot about in Sendai framework in the disaster risk reduction is the understanding. In the nature-based solutions also understanding plays a very key role. Now for example here in the left side it's a water erosion process going from detachment to transport to deposition. So if you understand what the surface will do, the surface changes will do, what the surface cover will do on the detachment, and to prevent the high intensity of rainfall or to get that energy and absorb it and not to get the soil detached from the surface will prevent the erosion. So these kind of things these are ideal things for the nature-based solutions to think through and then adapt solutions. In the case of wind, how do you prevent the saltation? Can you bring the green mechanisms to has wind barriers or things like that? so that we get the energy of the wind mitigated, and then the siltation and the wind erosion part get mitigated. So this is very important in the nature-based solutions, to design systems using the knowledge on the nature and the processes. Again, similarly, different environments require different designs. So the nature-based solutions also has to be designed for environment on one hand, other hand it should be adaptable. Now this is one of the designs IUCN Sri Lanka did lately on an irrigation project, and to bring the people and to get the home garden established, and also different paddy fields, and so different areas, different things you could do, different designs with nature-based solutions. This is only covering agriculture, but in the urban systems also we can say the same things. Now we can see how you use designs to mitigate flash floods, taking the water from the parking lots and putting it in the groundwater, and then cleaning it before that using the green infrastructure. So there are many applications coming around, mixing the green infrastructure as well as engineering together. In the coastal zone, many countries, the climate vulnerability is normally characterized by the German watch, and now these are the 2017 and after. You can see the high coastal areas with high vulnerability identified have adopted this green nature-based solutions more than the ones with the low vulnerability. With the low vulnerability side, we see more and more hybrid applications like mixing engineering and nature solutions have been adopted. So in this way, there's no one size fits all. So you have to continue to balance the benefits, the cost, and the risk. So the risk understanding is also very important in this context. Again, things don't go the way we want normally. That's the way. So we had to adjust, we had to plan again, we had to learn, we had to redo. That's we call the adaptive management. So that's also very important in the adoption of the nature-based solutions. The post-COVID situation, we highlight the human health, animal health, or what happened like when we have farms next to the forest, where we mix our animals with the wildlife, and the deforestation and loss of biodiversity. There are many things that are COVID, after the COVID, people have started thinking the new zoonotic diseases. So all these things are now coming to the mainstream of disaster risk reduction as well. So it's at the same time the money flow is also changing in the post-COVID transformation. The nature-based solution working with the ecosystems we call EcoDRR has the potential to connect the Sendai framework and also the UN the many conventions starting with Rio Conventions and UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the nature-based solutions are often described as no-regret options providing benefit to people in a range of scales. So in nature-based solutions, it's gaining momentum, it's gaining recognition as an entry point and a solution, and it's also a platform to convene and address societal issues ranging from poverty to risk reduction to climate change and many things, including the improving income that at the end leads to us sustainability and resilience. NBS need to be mainstream at all levels, national to subnational, and collecting all the different benefits. Sustainable financing, as we saw, is very important because without financing, it's difficult to do the restorations and all that. At the same time, multi-sector platforms can play a very key role in line with Sendai to understand, strengthen governance, and promote investments and to build back better processes. So the NBS has a lot into the future combined with engineering. There is a lot of potential. Thank you very much and have a very good day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anand Mallatantri, for a very informative presentation on green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. I think we are still waiting for the questions, comments, but till we get some. So I have a couple of maybe one or two questions, or the comments rather, maybe questions. So as you are pointing out, like, in one of the slides that you mentioned you have been using this, to control water erosion or wind erosion, so and so forth. So we have seen those are from much of like conservation point of view. So we know that the IUCN has been like promoting this type of like nature-based solutions more into ecosystem-based adaptation EBA for many years. So we also know that the IUCN has been engaging with for example, mangrove plantations, so the protect the coastline. So other than these, can you tell us some other areas that IUCN has been working on nature-based solutions? So over to you, Anand.
Thank you, Seneka. One area we just started working on is the central hill slopes in the country, where the water falls on the hill slopes is captured in the tanks and reservoirs and distributed into hydropower, irrigation, and drinking water needs. What the problem there is, we have a lot of deforestation and land degradation problems in the central hills. So the clouds come, but the clouds don't interact. There is no green infrastructure for the clouds to interact and make rain. So what we are trying to do is to fill those bold areas or degraded areas back with green infrastructure, so the cloud capturing will enhance. And then after that, work on the surfaces to make sure that what the rain comes goes into the soil and then slowly seeps into the stream network and into the reservoirs. So it's a very innovative thing in a way, but that knowledge had been there, but it's not applied in a scientific manner. So we are working with the International World Agroforestry Center on that, to bring the erosion knowledge and the water dimensions to the ground. And because Sri Lanka has invested a lot on irrigation infrastructure, what happens if there's no water? What happens if the tanks are silted, the reservoirs are silted? So these are the type of things. There are heavy duty challenges, and that links up with the droughts and floods together in one go. And I think we'll probably have a few more examples in the next session.
Thank you, Anand. So we have a question on it is about what are the issues we face when implementing nature-based solutions along with development activities?
The main problem, Mr. Chair, is the inability to value it. Now, for example, if you take mangroves, right now the value of the land, the mangrove land, is the market value. That's how many dollars or rupees per perch. But when you take it the real terms, the mangrove support fish, mangrove support tourism, mangrove supports to many other things, food, commercial aspects. So it's what is lacking is we don't have much mechanisms to bring all those benefit streams and quantify, and then put it together and say, this is not the market value, this is much beyond. So if you use the market value and take out that piece of mangrove or piece of that infrastructure, the long-term repercussions of disasters as well as loss of other revenue like fishing and tourism. So this integrated ability, luckily for us, now the natural capital assessments and accounting is emerging in a big way, because everybody realizes it's not only the disaster aspects, not only the economic aspects has to be taken into account.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is a little bit interesting. So in practice, the question is, in practice, have we adopted nature-based solutions for DRR in Sri Lanka?
Yes, we are one of the very small one we do is the restoration of old reservoirs, because old reservoirs are meant to capture the monsoon rains to prevent floods and also to provide water during the dry time. So that's one of the very easy ones we are working on around the country to get because that helps to address two disasters at the same time. But beyond that, there are complex issues we are working on in many aspects of disaster risk reduction, mostly on the chemicals now. Now, so far we have been working on the main ones, but now the poultry hormones, the agriculture chemicals and the industrial chemicals, our cancer rates are going up. So now we see another dimension of disasters creeping in addition to the climate change.
Dr. Anand, so I have another question actually. As you know that nature-based solutions or even let's say hybrid solutions are cost effective, which you have also been mentioning, and also environmental friendly. So this can be easily used to reduce or minimize disaster risks or climate risks. However, those are not widely used for some reasons. And can you tell us why it is happening? Is it because of lack of governance support or even advocacy, or a lack of awareness among the policymakers or the decision makers or the stakeholders?
I think answer is all of the above. But I think the vehicle is the natural capital accounting and assessments, because now the total benefit of hybrid solutions are not presented in a proper way with the positives and because our balance sheet only take care of only the probably the disaster side. But if you do a hybrid solution, we might gain many more benefits from drinking water or tourism or many other aspects. So now that comes back to the advocacy and the right tools for advocacy.
Thanks. This is going to be the last questions. We have only 2 more minutes probably. So do nature-based solution standards developed by IUCN can be applied at local level? How can community be made more participative?
Basically, it applies across any scale. And the wonder of that is that self-assessment tool I highlighted, because you can apply that at the village level. As a villager, I can stand and see how good I am doing on different aspects by using that kind of assessment tool.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Anand Mallatanki, for your interesting and very informative presentation and the responses as well. So
Thank
we
you.
are now,
Thank you.
Yeah. So we are now switch into the next keynote speech, which is keynote speech number 3. We have a speaker from Indonesia. I think you must be knowing her. So by name, Dr. Habunti Rahayu. She is actually currently working as a faculty member of the Institute of Technology Bandung. So we call ITB in Indonesia. So she's having a couple of other responsibilities. I think in this particular forum, I think better to highlight the position that she's having. She's also a chair of Working Group 1 of Intergovernmental Coordination Group of Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System, so which is very much related to this topic or the theme of the symposium. She has been working more than 20 years in academia, so as the university teacher or the researcher, and she has again sort of like she has done a lot of research, as well as she has won several the international awards. I mean, so without further ado, so let me request Dr. Hakunti to talk about or present the people-centered early warning system in the face of near-field tsunami, a lesson learned from Indonesia. Over to you, Dr. Hakunti.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Senaka. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I hope the screen is already okay. Yeah.
Yeah, visible.
Okay. Thank you very much. Oops, sorry. Yeah, I would like to share here that good afternoon or maybe good day in Sri Lanka, and then good morning in UK, and then good evening maybe some other part of the world if you are in the eastern part of Indonesia. Okay, and then I'm Harkunti Rahayu, as explained by Dr. Senaka, that I'm chairing of Working Group 1. Actually, the task of this Working Group 1 is to make sure all these 24 country of the member of Indonesian tsunami warning and mitigation system, they really adopt the tsunami risk assessment and then awareness as well as preparedness. So my topic here that I would like to share with everybody here in the keynote lectures is I would like to share related with the people-centered early warning system in the face of near-face tsunami, because a lot of the country in Indian Ocean as well as other basin are exposed to near-face tsunami. So this is the case of Indonesia that I think is very much related with my task as the chair of the Working Group 1, as well as some of the research that I collaborate with my dear friends, Dilanti and Richard. And then everybody must understand that what is effective tsunami early warning system. We cannot have tsunami warning system without knowing this effectiveness. So the effective tsunami early warning system is actually an integration of natural, socio-technical, and physical phenomena aiming to save people as many as possible by alerting the people at risk with sufficient lead time to make decision for evacuation. So this is very much look like very much easy to understand, but if you are talking about the lead time, most of the Indonesian places are exposed to the near-face tsunami, so the lead time is very little. So we need also to investigate how is the tsunami warning system should be benefit for Indonesia, and what is the ideal situation for the tsunami warning system to be implemented for Indonesia. So if you are talking about the tsunami warning system, I would like to refer about the people-centered tsunami early warning system. There are actually the school of thought that I would like to share here. First, everybody must understand about the UNISDR tsunami warning system, what we call the people-centered early warning system. So, and then the second one, maybe some of you have read about the Indonesian tsunami warning system. So the right side of my slide here, telling about the grand scenario of Indonesian tsunami early warning system, which is basically divided into two, the structure component and culture component. So the structure actually is the function of detection, monitoring, and then transmitting the data, and then analyzing the data, and then disseminating the data as well as to the what we call this interface agency. And then the culture component is starting from the interface agency to the general public. So this is really basic concept when we developed at the beginning of 2005. But we can see here during the Bonn meeting, the tsunami warning system, what they call people-centered tsunami early warning system, for the UNISDR, they divided into four, starting from what is the risk knowledge, and then monitoring and warning services, and then dissemination and communication, and then response capability. If we can borrow from the Indonesian grand scenario that the division of this warning system, structure and culture, basically what they call the people-centered early warning system, according to UNISDR, that 3/4 of this component is actually the culture system. So you can see here, the culture is the most heavy part of the warning system itself. So what is the culture here? If we can understand not only the risk knowledge, the ability and capacity of dissemination and communication. Last but not least, the most important here, how the response capability from the local government as well as the community. And then we can see by these two issues here, there are critical issues that we can highlight here. First is the liability sharing between national and local government for the structure and culture component. And then current state of this culture, as you can see here, there are more difficult compared to the structure. The structure is fully technology, but the culture is a kind of mix of the social, technology, and many other issues. The variability of this culture component actually depend on the diversity of the tsunami risk level. You can see from place to place, tsunami risk is very unique. It depends on their vulnerability, their capacity, and how their bathymetry of the city itself, in front of the city, the position of the city in front of the coastal area. And then diversity of tsunami readiness, as well as diversity of the people and appreciating the tsunami warning system itself. Just remember to recall back on the 2004 tsunami event. That has become wake-up call for Indonesia in developing Indonesian tsunami early warning system and also intervention for disaster risk reduction. You can see here, like I mentioned before, the structure component, or we call this upstream component, are fully developed. Science, technology, and full operation since 2008 and keep on also improving until now toward the 4.0 generation of warning system for Indonesia. But if you can see here on the culture component, even though the science engineering, but the social issue is very much embedded in this component. So even though we have starting since 2005, developing not only inundation, not only the infrastructure for evacuation, for example, evacuation route, and then shelter and so on, and also for warning system, the downstream, for example, the existence of the siren and so on, but there is still a lot of homework for us. We still have challenge at not only at the national, but we have at the local, and then as well as the regional. The challenge very much huge for Indonesia. From place to place, not only the diversity of the culture, but also the reaction of the people is become a big homework for us. How appreciation of the people toward the warning. This photo actually has been used by myself when every many occasion. Maybe some of you have seen this photo before, but this photo is become a very big moment for us, not only for myself, but also for Indonesian government. What's wrong with the intervention that has been in place for Indonesia? What happened with the warning system, especially in the downstream? Because the warning has been issued properly, but the response of the people is still remain like this. So, and then the president asked the team, I mean, like including myself, to think about what should we do. That's why, because of this photo, because of this event, we come up with the blueprint of disaster risk reduction master plan for tsunami. So this has become a homework, not only the tsunami warning, but also all the downstream of the tsunami warning should be in place. So other issue here that I would like to highlight. So this is a comparison if there is, the question of the effectiveness of tsunami warning system. Tsunami warning system has been in place. If tested using the drill, will be beautifully done because we have so many national drill. We have also so many local drill. We have so many regional drill. The issue here, when they tested the real event, for example, in Padang, people are panic, especially they are not really ready with the real scenario. For example, earthquake followed by a fire and then followed by the tsunami warning and so on. But luckily during that time, even though there is no major tsunami, even though only 80 centimeters, but the people was panicked. So what happened if this is occur with the real tsunami? So this is become a homework for us. Everything is not just only exercise, but we need also to see the system whether it's realistic or not. So that's why my focus here in the Padang city, because Padang is one of the city in Indonesia, which is very prone to tsunami, especially near field tsunami. So the travel time is less than 30 minutes. And luckily they have this Mentawai archipelago or Mantai Island is become the buffer toward the Padang city, but they should be ready for the next tsunami in the near future. So the strategic issue that we thought that we would like to see in the term if in developing of the tsunami warning system based on the people-centered idea is we have to see compliance of the tsunami early warning system at the city level to existing legal document at the local level. And then about the compliance of tsunami early warning system with the condition at the local level. And then who are the potential actors to be involved in order to strengthen the downstream warning chains and to reach the last mile. So this is a kind of what I would like here, that not only the critical issue that we need to highlight here, also we have to understand the parameter, how we need to improve the downstream warning chains. There are 4 parameters that we need to understand here and to investigate at the situation in one city. The first one, we have to understand how is the social cognitive behavior of the community itself in responding the warning. And then in what ways physical and non-physical factors of urban or rural setting will affect those social cognitive behavior of the community itself. And then how is the responsibility of multiple disaster-related actors and obtain, utilize, exchange information regarding on the warning itself, and what were the characteristics of the network of information flow and multiple actors for coordination and responding early warning. So basically this parameter talking about their capacity of these people in responding the warning itself and conveying the warning itself, how they can collaborate and coordinate among the community in responding the warning. So looking at the grand scenario, not only grand scenario, the detailed data information flow of the Indonesian tsunami warning system that I mentioned before, the upstream, downstream structure and culture component, actually there are missing links here, especially on the downstream. You know, between the local government reaching the community is very huge. And like I mentioned before, the variability is very complex and very huge. And during our in-depth research that we identify, actually there is a lot of capacity that we can utilize, we can incorporate based on their capacity, based on their practice, as also based on their willingness to participate on the downstream warning chat itself. For example, the assisting of the indigenous knowledge, the assisting of the MOS network, and then the assisting of the coastal community groups, for example, the EKUB, and then community resilient group, and also alternative means that has been emerged on the community, starting from the, IT 2.0 or IT 4.0, talking about the smart until the smartphone. So we have, this is our rationale actually in dealing with how we can develop the people-centered early warning system, for example, for the case of Padang City. So we have this rationale that the major regulation on the warning system already obsolete because it's 2010, and there is a lot of things is not comply with the current situation of the warning system itself and should be updated. But not only that, because not only they comply with the national system, but they need also to see the capacity and the capability in themselves among the government itself as well as the community, how they can improve the downstream warning scene by looking at the people-centered warning system. So this is I would like to share here if I could put the network based on the existing major regulation on the number 14, 2010. So you can see here is very weak. It's only relying on the mayor system, receiving information direct from BMKG or from their EOC, and then they become the central to disseminate the warning to all the stakeholders. What happens if this is very weak and this is not robust at all? So that's why we have to work closely with Padang. The first step here, we work with the city stakeholders, the city level stakeholders, all the agency, all the institution at the city level, we ask them to talk with us, and then we sit together and we identify about their capacity, their function, also their practice so far in dealing with the warning system. I'm really surprised. Actually, without acknowledge of their legal aspect on the tsunami warning system, actually this is the common practice they highlight that I can identify among the city institution or the city stakeholders. There is a lot of contribution, and you can see here many network actually or many actors has been involved at the city level. But we can see here this is not enough because we understand based on this FGD that we understand there is a lot of potential actors that we can incorporate in improving people-centered warning system. What are these actors? We would like to see how is the community, how is the representative of the community, whether they can be involved or not. And then the second layer here, we are working directly with the community themselves. So we try to map what is the capacity of this community and then how they practice so far in using their communication system, etc., in sharing the communication among each other. So we can see here there are more involvement of the community and representative of community in sharing the information regarding the warning system itself. So we have this case location that we identify all of these partners in the community level. And then I would like to share here some identified existing community network. not only the MOS network, but also they have the how is the EOC siren can reach the people, and also face-to-face communication, as well as using other methods of communication. For example, in this type is how is in the village level, they communicate each other using their existing device. So the device here that I would like to show you here, that this is the device that has been used at the community level. G here is from government to mid or intermediate. They use a lot of mode of device of communication. For example, they have siren, radio, internet, telephone, face-to-face, MOS network, SMS, and then handy-talkie or city radio communication. And then from the intermediate, with the intermediate, they have this is telephone. Also, they have SMS, they have this strength. But as you can see here, from government to people, you can see there is a lot of communication device. And then from the intermediate to community is amazing. They have this face-to-face, they have the MOS network. Also, they have this a lot of strengths among them. So looking at this map and also of the network of communication, we try to map and then we identify the significant role of these intermediate actors actually in the downstream tsunami warning system. Like I mentioned before, the intermediate actors actually not only the community leader, but also a group of people and a group of the business, and then a group of women or a group of the people surrounding and with the same activity. So this is, we can identify the existence of the intermediate actor actually can cover the gap if they're not involved. So the gap is about 29% they can cover if we include them into the warning system, especially in the downstream. So having this downstream has been mapped. This is not enough because we need also how we can engage with the city government and how we can engage with the national government. That's why we have a series of the focus group discussion, series of seminar, and then as well as how they can perceive this concept of the people-centered warning system that can be used to encourage them to have include the intermediate actor as part formally as part of the downstream warning system. And then we test this the concept used during tsunami Indian Ocean wave exercise, and then it's come up with technical recommendation and standard operating procedure for the warning system, especially at the city level. So resulted that we test here in the IO wave, and we also include not only all the stakeholders and also intermediate actors, but also we include a lot of new potential, which is reaching the very last mile. And then last but not least, this improved network that we have been working and then engage with all the community, engage with all the stakeholders at the city level has been adapted to improve the major degree on the tsunami warning for Padang City. So this is like what I would like to share, that the capacity actually of the community, they are even though voluntarily, but they are really willing to share what they have to save the others. So acknowledging them into part of the downstream warning system make them not only happy, but they feel acknowledged by the government. So they feel that the government is there and they feel part of the system, part of the society to help each other. So this is a very good approach that I would like to share here, that policy actually can be changed using the good research, inspiration on how to use the field as living laboratory to recognize and solve the problem for saving lives. For example, we have been working 3 years in a row by making as our studio, as our laboratory, Padang City, with all the students and all the research assistant. We are working closely, not only with the government level, but also with this community. It's really helpful to identify those champions that are willing, not only willing, but they have the capacity to communicate as usual. And then through participatory process, building trust, not only trust to us, but trust from the community to government as well, the other way around. And then through participatory process, not only to make positive change in policy, but also action to be implemented. Last but not least, here I would like to conclude the public engagement is very important. Without public engagement, no matter what, you have a good result, you have a good product, it's very difficult to build the trust and then optimize the use of this product. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hagunti. It was very informative and interesting, as always. So we have time limit now. So we have very limited time, but we do have a couple of questions as well.
Yeah.
The first question is like, what are your views about community trust about early warning and evacuation? If you can quickly provide your feedback, comment.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sanaka. Yes, community trust is very important because before we work with them, they just, share the information among them without any having, formalized, included in the system. But by having them on board, formally they include in the system, they are really happy and they are really trust the government and they become also the promoter for this concept of the early warning, how important that people should respect the system themselves because they are representative of the community. They are representative of the voice of humanity. And if they are trusted, so the trust will be, two ways, not only to the system, but the system also trusts them. So this is what I could highlight, Dr. Sanaka.
Yeah, thanks. The next question is about the question is, what are the most important aspects of governance systems to ensure effective early warning systems?
Pardon? Could you repeat again? Sorry.
Yeah, what are the most important aspects of governance systems to ensure effective early warning systems?
Yeah, especially Indonesia, we have very wide, and then from city to city, we have a different jurisdiction structure. So the most important here is like, not only promoting, but is what you call here, include them formally is one of the issues very important here. So we need to identify also what is the capacity in the city itself, not only at the national and not only in the government, city government, that also what is the structure of the community that need to be included formally into the degree of the mayor. So this is one of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, the next one is, what do you think about the vertical evacuation and the possibility of implementing such systems as the lead time is very, very low?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Since the lead time is very low, what we need to do is first disseminate the information as fast as you could. You can reach as much as you could, as has been proven by including all these intermediate actors. So the coverage will be more than before. The second issue here, the assistance of vertical evacuation is become a critical issue because it's, shorten the travel time of the people to go to the safe place. So they just go to the vertical evacuation. But we have to understand the assistance of vertical evacuation should be calculated, not only developed there, but we need to see whether this vertical evacuation, which is really can accommodate all the people at risk. Otherwise, people will killing each other, just fighting to get to be safe. So that's why we have to be wise enough to identify how many vertical evacuation are needed, especially for the urban area.
Yeah, maybe this question is very much related to Indonesia. So the question, if I read, how could this be implemented in all parts of Indonesia so that it would be equally safe? Would there be more gaps to fill? What about the knowledge so that people will not destroy the tools for tsunami early warning systems, which has been the case?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, moderator, Dr. Sanaka. Yeah, for Indonesia, from east to west, from west to east, Sabang to Merauke, we have very huge variability. Not only the culture, but also the physical condition is very much different. But adapting this, I'm sure, is not a big problem because the concept, we need to identify the differences because each city is unique. Each community is also unique. So I believe in every city, in every municipality, they have all this champion, that they have also their capacity of this champion, that usually without any appreciation of the government, they are voluntarily doing this, disseminating the warning. But by including them formally into the system, they will be more, not only more happy, but they can more engage with all the community to appreciate with the system by themselves, including protecting the existing system in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe the last two questions. So this is, of course, is a little bit generic one. So what are the tools that your country has used for active community participation or engagement for DRR?
What are the tools you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. This is very interesting because the national government, we have a lot of program actually. We have, maybe you heard about disaster resilient village. And also we have now a special disaster tsunami village, resilient village. So this is kind of tool how we can engage all the community to be involved with this all DRR. But if you are talking about the city, we have also city DRR, city DRR resilience. So this is part of the Indonesian program. And also there is mandatory, if the city doesn't have risk assessment, they will not get support from the national government in terms of, for example, vertical evacuation. Because vertical evacuation shelter, it's still very expensive and exclusive. So this is a kind of deal between national and the local government in dealing with this DRR. Yeah.
Yeah, this question is also a little bit generic one, but it's a kind of more into cities. So what do you think about this SFDRR, Sendai framework, when creating DRR, disaster risk reduction procedures in a resilient city? It's a very much generic one again.
Okay, I think SFDRR cannot be standalone. There is a lot of global commitment now in the world. Like if you have UN Habitat, and also the aim is also for the city resilient city, and also SDGs, like Sustainable Development Goals. Also they have. So this a lot of global commitment. There should be what I call here synergize. So not every country will be confused which one to follow, but you can see the SFDRR is very complete, talking from the term disaster risk reduction. But if you can't talk about the SDGs, they are more on the governance and they are more political. So it should be in line with this because we have a lot of this city resilient program. So it should be in line with that. Yeah. I hope it answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think pretty much. Yeah. So maybe this is going to be the very last one. So like as you have been presenting near field tsunami events, so which has less than 30-minute lead time. So this will not allow the people or the institutes, national governments to get back to tsunami service providers to verify. It's a very limited time. So in that case, in particular, Padang, in your case, so you need to probably activate whatever the issue, the warnings and evacuation orders. So once it is done, have you ever experienced in the past, like if you after issuing, so maybe there might be some sort of like false alarm events. So were there any similar events? And if that is the case, so how this community and people reacted to this national agencies? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Senaka. So if you are looking at my last slide, the second last slide of my presentation, when we make the standard operating procedure by integrating the community idea and then the intermediate actors, actually we found there is a lot of the amazing thing that people in Padang, for example, I think a lot of people in Indonesia, if they know because they are exposing to the near field tsunami, they trust the tsunami warning from the central government, but they would like to save themselves first. That's why we are formally include what we call heads up. Heads up here is they can use the natural sign, for example, the strong shaking to evacuate. So they have what we call self-evacuation without waiting for the warning system. But they're still relying on the warning system by running, by evacuating. If there is a formal warning system, they will announce through the siren that the tsunami will occur. So they just continue evacuate, whether to vertical evacuation or go inland to the safe place. So this is what formally include in our SOP, and then to make. So I just received this from the community, their willingness to tell everybody that the strong shaking, they might have potential, but just avoiding the rumor and gossip. So this is what they are doing. And then the other one here. So if the tsunami has not been occurred because the shaking is come from the land, they're not complaining, they are happy to go back to their home. So this is the commitment that has been built during the process in developing the standard operating procedure for this people-centered warning system. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So with that, we have come to close of this the keynote speech session. So let me, on behalf of the organizers, let me thank you, Dr. Anand Malotantri, as well as Dr. Hagunti, for your excellent intervention presentations. And also, I would like to thank all the attendees to take part of the session. I suppose, we suppose this is a good start for the day 2 of the conference, the symposium. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Stay
Yeah.
tuned.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Saka. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gammedda, by the people, for the people. Gammedda, loosely translating to the heart of the village, was born from the idea of connectivity, of bridging the political, economical, religious and cultural divide to find those truly in need. After years of broken promises from successive governments, News First began the Gammedda initiative, and it has become not just a word but a symbol of hope for an entire nation. In all of Sri Lanka's history, this is the largest ongoing humanitarian initiative today. Conceptualizing Go Beyond Reporting by Mr. R. Rajamahendran, the chairman of Capital Maharaja Group, Gammedda Janatha Mandapaya Forum began in villages to give a voice to the unheard in rural Sri Lanka. In the year 2016, News First teamed up with the University of Peradeniya to conduct a research and document the most striking issues in the country. After the completion of the door-to-door island-wide survey, Gammedda embarked on a 100-day project initiative. Followed by a successful phase, Gammedda then stepped into another 100-day project phase, which also became a success beyond expectations. Today, Gammadda is undertaking projects as a solution to the most striking issues in rural Sri Lanka: drinking water, access roads, school development, sanitation, bridges, elephant fences. Gammadda intervention in natural disasters. Natural disasters such as floods have plagued the country over the past several years, claiming the lives of hundreds. Most efforts so far dealt post-disaster situation instead of preparing our populace for the disasters that they could face. Gammadda, with the support of the entire Capital Maharaja Group, has not only acted promptly as the occurrence of any disaster, but also worked on disaster preparedness. Sahana Yatra was initiated in 2014 to provide relief aid to those affected by adverse weather conditions in Sri Lanka. Dry rations were collected in our premises to be distributed to the affected areas. Flood awareness campaigns. Gammadda partnered with Disaster Management Center and Asia Pacific Alliance for disaster management and organized a series of workshops in order to raise awareness and prepare for possible natural disasters. Flood awareness campaigns were targeted at areas which were predicted to be the worst affected by floods. Evidently, the death rates were declined after conducting flood preparedness awareness campaigns. Drowning is among the top 3 reasons for deaths in Sri Lanka. With Sri Lanka Lifesaving carrying out more than 350 rescues each year, the number keeps growing. In order to combat the issue and raise awareness, WeForce launched a program to bring together volunteers and reporters to highlight the importance of drowning prevention. Gammadda is recognized by many eminent organizations internationally as well as nationally, including UNOCHA, the Japan Times, University of Oxford, Brown University, University of Peradeniya, etc. United Nations Humanitarian Summit appreciated Gammadda for its unique and effective style of helping Sri Lankans, whilst the Japan Times acknowledged Gammadda to be an initiative the world can learn from. The trust and credibility earned from the people throughout the years have made Gammadda the most powerful humanitarian movement by the people, for the people.
all